Welcome back, everybody. We're going to try to get started. I appreciate you all finding your way back after eating. This is the third panel of the day entitled Slums and Markets, Opportunities or Failure. And there's that word failure again. I'll talk about that in a second. This panel is constructed with the goal of addressing a few questions. First is how and when do markets facilitate the formation of slums? I think the answer is they facilitate the formation of slums all the time and everywhere, and that's why we're here today. And there's embedded in the title is this notion of failure, and somehow there's a market failure that's producing these slums. I think that this reminds me of the aphorism that says that every system is perfectly designed to produce the outcome it produces. And so I think what we're seeing is that, in fact, markets are producing slums, and in some sense they are the solution to some needs and wants. And so the question, I think, for this panel in part is to understand what are those market forces, how are they operating, and how does that help inform our thinking about responses to slums. The second question then is how do global trends in the labor market, including demographic and technological shifts, condition the economic opportunity of slum dwellers? And so I think there's a little bit, and the conversation today, and I think this panel reflects it, has started by a bit backward looking and saying, how have we conceived of slums in the past? What interventions have we had? This panel will continue that to understand what are the forces that have produced slums, but start to look forward to and say, what are the forces going forward that we have to anticipate? Because the world isn't static, and in fact, various things are happening that will make these conditions worse or perhaps better. And then the last question is to explore what kind of opportunities slums represent and for whom, with an eye on land, labor, and housing markets. And I think we're here because the hope is that they do provide opportunity, and the question is how do you channel, how do you realize, how do you pursue those opportunities in a way that benefits the community. So with that as the goal, we have 4 speakers in this panel, and I think they reflect expertise in various domains, reflecting housing markets, land markets, labor markets, all of which are operating and important influences on these conditions. And I think one of the challenges as I said at the outset, that we have to do is understand that the solution doesn't lie just in labor market responses or housing market responses or land market responses. It lies in responses that reflect all those. And if you only focus on one, you'll miss the whole picture. And so the challenge, I think, for the panel is, given their different expertise, is are they, and you can ask them this, are they seeing across those domains to have a more holistic response? This panel will be a little bit different than the others in the sense that all the panelists have a presentation. This is my own personal bias. I like when speakers have presentations because I think, it kind of forces them to make sure that there's a logic to their presentation. We can test whether they're following their logic. And if you lose attention for a moment, you can look up at the screen and find out where they are, hopefully. So what I'm going to do is rather than have them come up here, they're going to come up one at a time, do their short presentations, and then we'll have a group discussion. So George Galster is our first presenter. George is a professor emeritus from Wayne State University in Detroit. He's a lifelong Michigander who has now decamped to retire. He's the only older person who's retired to Portland, Oregon. All the other people who retired there are young people. George is an economist. Yesterday in our introductions among the speakers, I introduced myself as a reluctant economist. George McCarthy introduced himself as a recovering economist, and George introduced himself as a real economist. And so, and George has a very renowned career in housing and neighborhood economics, written a number of really important books on the subject, and so I thought of no better person to provide that framing for us. A couple of his books, one that came out just a few years ago is Driving Detroit, The Quest for Respect in the Motor City, a bit of a personal account almost of the history of Detroit. And then he has a book coming out shortly that's Making Our Neighborhoods, Making Ourselves. So clearly his work is very apropos of what we're trying to get at in this discussion. So George, let me turn it over to you. Come up and start us off for this panel.
Thanks very much, Chris, for that kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to join the conversation. Chris asked me to do a high-level view of how markets relate to this issue called slums, and also to talk about what kind of emerging trends in international markets especially might affect slum formation for ill or for better in the global north. But before doing that, I thought, based on the conversation that I've heard thus far in this conference, go to, if you will, some fundamentals. It seems to me that if we are to be serious about ultimately talking about policy prescriptions, we have to be very precise in defining the problem to begin with. Then we can accurately diagnose what the problem is all about. And last, we can then provide that prescription. So what I'd like to begin with is my definition of this word that's been on the screen a lot but nobody has yet defined, and that's slums. So my definition of a slum is quite simple. It's people occupying substandard housing, where substandard is defined by local social norms. Now, what I think has been a challenge for this group is to focus in on the core definition of slums, which is what I believe this phrase involves. And the reason why it's challenging is because I think that there are flavors of slums. I'd like to suggest that we can categorize slums along 3 separate dimensions, according to our conversations earlier. Think about a 3-dimensional cube. On each face of that cube are 4 squares, or if you will, each is a 2x2 matrix. And in the 3 dimensions represented on the sides of this cube are these questions. Is infrastructure provided? Yes, no. Is it a formal or informal settlement? Yes, no. And is the place so concentrated that it's stigmatized by the larger society? Yes, no. Now, much of the conversation we've heard from our friends in the Global South talks about one particular cell of those 8 flavors of slums. It's a cell where infrastructure is not provided, it's informal, and the place is stigmatized. Okay. But we heard this morning from Jake about a different kind of slum in American cities like Los Angeles, where infrastructure is provided, it's informal, and the place is not stigmatized because the informality is sprinkled around a perfectly respectable neighborhood. But yet we also know from earlier work that in this case of colonias in the United States, it's a different cell in this grid. Infrastructure is not provided. It's informal, and the place may or may not be stigmatized. Yet there's another model that's from my hometown of Detroit. It consists of a decaying city where single-family detached homes are slums amid quite respectable homes in a quite respectable neighborhood. Because there's so little housing demand, they can be converted to occupancy by low-income people. Infrastructure is there because it's an old established neighborhood. It's a formal kind of rental agreement. The place is not stigmatized. And I would think that there might be other examples from other places in the world which could fill in most of these 8 different types of slums. What I would suggest is that we be very specific going forward in this conference of talking about specifically what flavor of slum are we really trying to diagnose and make a prescription for. What's common, I think, to all these flavors is the fact that no matter what the national context is, if it's a capitalist, market-driven society, the market is designed to create slums. Why? Because a market is going to say if there's a mismatch between the ability to pay by the least well-off citizens in that society and what it costs to provide standard housing quality, there's going to be slums. A mismatch between ability to pay of the least advantaged and the cost of occupying standard housing. Given that mismatch, slums are going to happen. You don't need formality, informality. You don't need government failure. You don't need anything. You just have to have the market do its thing. There'll be a demand for slums, and the market will supply them. So let me try to break that out a little more specifically. The first question that Chris asked me to address: do market economies inevitably produce slums in the absence of government intervention? Well, I'd say it depends, but history suggests that almost always it does, because it depends on this relationship between ability of pay of the lowest income group and the occupancy price. And we've seen historically that almost always capitalism has produced a very poor off, low income segment of the population that cannot afford decently supplied housing quality based on current prices. And given that imbalance between the ability to pay and occupancy costs, you're going to see the market producing slums. But I think it's helpful to unpack that relationship a little bit more. What does the ability to pay depend on? What do the occupancy costs depend on? Well, labor markets and housing markets. So let's first talk about the labor market. The ability to pay of the lowest income folks in the system, no matter what nation we're talking about, is ultimately going to be a force determined by labor supply and demand factors. So let's unpack the labor supply factors in an economy. The labor supply by skill is going to be a function of the domestic population and their educational system. And of course, international migration is going to affect labor supply. The labor demands by skill level in an economy are going to be a function of the technology, scale, and profitability of domestic versus foreign businesses. What about on the other side of the market, the housing market side of it, that will ultimately produce a cost of occupancy? Again, housing supply versus housing demand. The housing supply by quality is going to be determined by the current housing stock and how it is distributed across the quality distribution. It's going to be determined by the building technology and the prices and availability of land, construction materials, and labor, and of course, energy. Housing demand by quality level is going to be a function of the domestic distribution of income and wealth, the domestic distribution of population by age and family size, the number of international investors in housing, and of course, the mortgage finance system. Now, why do I unpack all of these sides of the housing market and labor market? I think there are important implications for going through that particular set of logic. First is that there's a lot of different components of a nation's market economy where slums can be encouraged or discouraged. There's a lot of elements of the labor market side, there's a lot of elements of the housing market side, and of course, the land market works its way into the housing market. So there's a lot of different pieces that work together to create slums. Second implication is that there are many potential components, both within and outside of the housing market, where government intervention might be contemplated to fight slums. In other words, don't just think about slums and fighting slums as a housing policy. It's as much an income or anti-poverty policy as it is a housing policy, potentially. And so there's lots of ways, as Chris suggested, to think about where government could intervene to fight slums. Part of it might involve housing, but part of it might involve economic development, education, and anti-poverty program. And there's another implication which I thought of based on our earlier conversation. This analysis suggests that slums are not other. They're not an aberration to a market economy. They're an integral functioning piece and result of a market economy. The second set of issues that Chris asked me to address is, what does my crystal ball tell me about what's going on in the market that is going to affect slums in the future? I think that in the global north, there are storm clouds coming. There are lots of worrisome trends that are coming on both the labor market side as well as the housing market side. And in the couple minutes that I have remaining, let me just outline what I think is in those crystal balls. First of all, on the labor market supply and demand side, rising poverty, that is to say, lower absolute standards of living for the lowest income people in the global north. Why? Increasing redundancy of low-skilled labor via automation, increasing international outsourcing and competition, driving down wages in the global north. The second force is increasing immigration of low-skilled workers. Although in the United States, you know, there's a big political backlash against that, I still think we in the global north are increasingly going to face increasing pressures for international immigration, given not only political upsets, but climate-induced upsets, as was suggested earlier today. There's worrisome housing market demand trends as well. The rising wealth at the upper end of the income distributions of virtually every economy in the global north ends up reverberating throughout the entire quality submarket array. In other words, when the rich bid up the price of luxury housing, those assessed values echo all the way down to the least quality housing, and everybody's prices get bid up or pulled up, if you will, by what's going on with the bidding power of the wealthy. The second thing happening on the demand side is increasingly the financialization of housing, not as a place to live, but as a place to invest. Big money international investors, both individuals and large firms, are buying, but never intending to occupy or rent out these dwellings. In certain tier 1 luxury cities like New York, London, Sydney, Australia, they're buying luxury housing purely for an asset, purely to hope it appreciates in value into the future. They don't want to rent it out or sell it to anybody else in the near future. Now, they might do this for illegal reasons like money laundering, or they might do it for legal reasons, but it really doesn't matter. Both of these trends are going to intensify the gap between the ability to pay at the bottom of the income distribution and the costs of getting into the housing market for decent, standard quality housing. There's also a worrisome trend on the supply side of housing. Both of those previous demand side forces, the rising wealth and the financialization of housing, is distorting the industry. The construction industry is being distorted in many northern cities, diverting it into the luxury submarket. Housing construction capacity that would have been built for people to actually occupy these houses is instead being diverted into dwellings that are never going to be occupied. The second force is the rise of international tourism. Tourism demands in the major cities are also distorting the construction industry because they're diverting capacity to building hotels instead of building houses. And then even worse, the tourist industry is encouraging the sharing economy through vehicles such as Airbnb, Vacasa, and other kinds of places where people, instead of having apartments for long-term occupancy on the market, are instead converting them to short-term occupancy like a quasi-hotel. All of that takes away from the existing housing stock that would have been used to hold down prices to give families a chance to live in decent housing. So both of these forces of the rising wealth and financialization of housing, the rise of tourism, are inflating land and housing construction costs for all quality submarkets, and again, making it harder to make ends meet at the bottom end of the income distribution because it's pushing up the cost for occupying decent quality housing. So that has been the end of my basic presentation. I hope to have suggested that the discussion of housing could be helped by focusing in on fundamentals, which fundamentally every flavor of slums is the same in terms of its lack of good quality housing that's being occupied. There's lots of other variants around that theme, but that core theme of lack of good quality housing is a market phenomenon. It's a market phenomenon that's ultimately produced by an economy where the interaction of labor and housing markets produces a situation where for the lowest income people, they cannot afford to occupy decent quality housing because of the occupancy costs of those kinds of structures. In those kind of circumstances, we're going to have slums. Thank you very much for your attention.
And I just want to commend George. For the most part, he listened to Emma when she held up the stop sign, but other panelists take note that George is setting a good model for trying to stick within our time. We do want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion with all of you. And one of the things I wanted to mention too, and I'll do it now, is a pitch for coming tomorrow through the end of the day when we're going to have the last session is what's called a fishbowl. And the fishbowl is a chance for a panel discussion where the panelists are all of you. And so what the panelists is, it allows people who want to speak and get involved in the conversation to come down, join that conversation, and then we rotate you in and out. And so we realize that both between all the folks we've invited to be up here formally and also informally in the audience, that there's a lot of views to share a lot of expertise. So just a pitch that we realize that if you haven't had an opportunity today to engage yourself in the conversation, please make sure you come through the end of the day tomorrow for that. With that commercial, back to our regularly scheduled program. Our next speaker is another economist. George, I will say that you lived up to your billing as a real economist, by the way. And you did the profession proud. So, but our next speaker, Martim Smolka from the Lincoln Land Institute, is another economist. The progression now is Martim in his comments will be focusing more specifically on the land market and how the land market's operating and how it has worked to produce slums. And I think you'll see some consistent themes. Martim is a senior fellow and director of the program in Latin America and the Caribbean at the Lincoln Institute. More on the website for his bio. But please, Martim, come up and look forward to hearing your views.
Thank you. I'll start following immediately from George and saying that, let me see how, yeah, there are many kinds of substandard housings, and we've been talking here, and I could add at least another 7 of these circles with different cases. So, and I like this idea of focusing on where is the problem, right? And the contribution that I hope to bring here has to do with what land has to do with that. And normally when we talk about slums, there is always the issue of affordability is always a land issue. So let's see how we can get a little bit further on that. So I'm gonna pose a few issues that I'm not gonna develop because I don't have the time, but we could come back to them in the discussion. One of them is the what I call the non-affordability paradox, and this is the idea that people cannot afford buying house in the formal market, but they end up paying more in the informal market, given the circumstances of how they operate. And this is something that's mind-boggling, because the more you look at these informal markets, the more you see the prices that people are actually paying there. And this has a number of interesting consequences. For instance, we all know about the issues about the water supply, when you have to improvise getting water, when you have to improvise, for instance, a bricklayer in a consolidated area of Pieterse, normally they charge much more to lay bricks there in a new house or something like that than in the asphalt. And the reason for that is pretty obvious. It's not easy to bring bricks where they need to be they will be used. This is just one aspect of it. And there are, for instance, supplying supermarkets, all these things, they are much harder to find in most places where slums are located. But there is an interesting thing about this, when we talk about slums, there's always, and this issue came very, in many occasions during this last day of discussion so far, and that is the issue of poverty. As if slum and poverty, of course, there is the geography of poverty and slums. There are pretty much there is a overlap on that to a large extent. But once you look more carefully on the stock and the changes, this is not necessarily so. So you have many, and this has been empirically demonstrated that you can there is no correlation on changes of informality and changes of poverty. You can have increasing of poverty with reduction of informality and vice versa. And I'm bringing here the case of Chile, and the case of Chile is interesting because it's one of the few countries in Latin America that has basically eliminated informality, almost eliminated informality. It's 1.4% of the occupants or the population is informal. But it has an interesting thing, and this is pretty evident there. In these informal areas, 51% of the households are non-poor, and the population of 12% of the population is poor, yet only 1.4 in slums. So there is a big disconnection there. And why is that? And the studies that we have been funding to understand better the thing, it ends up demonstrating that the main issue is location, location, location. It's basically people looking for places where they can access better jobs, and they're willing to accept some of the burden of informal occupations, or the type of housing, or substandard housing, things like that, for the benefit of accessing the job market. Here is another point that, reinforcing what George said a few minutes ago about the supply and who has what do you need in order to access housing. And this is a very conservative data on the building costs per square meter, the size of a typical social housing, and the cost of land, the interest rate, and there are extremely conservative numbers here. Let me put it this way. So you basically, we're talking about that you need an income of at least $500 to access a typical social housing. In the case of Brazil, that is it's not the poorest country in the world, I tell you that. 34% of the population is below that. So they cannot access a social housing without heavy subsidies. And of course, they're not in slums. The slum, the percentage of the population slums is about, in the case of Rio de Janeiro, it's pretty high. It's about 20-something%. So that there is a big disconnection there. So this is, I think, it's an important thing for us to, because it has a number of interesting consequences from the policy point of view. What are the consequences that it has? First, when we identify poverty with slums, there's basically you're giving a sort of a local administrator say, well, listen, I can't do this. This is not my problem. This is a problem in my city. It's not a problem of my city. Poverty has to do with income policy, and it has to do with employment. I can't handle that. This is a problem that someone dumps in my city. And this is de-responsabilization of local agents. And it's over and over we see that, listen, they just drop these problems in my cities, as if I don't have any responsibility on that. Second, there is a certain kind of glorification of slums as a solution, as if this resolves the problem. Then the slums is a way of addressing this thing. And I mentioned already, it's not really the case. This non-affordability paradox, it's pretty heavy. The options people have, and sometimes slums is simply not, is that people live there because this is the only alternative they have, period. It's not because it's cheaper or more expensive at the end, but it's simply because it's an alternative they have, and they end up paying more. There is this, from a policy point of view, there is this third element here, and that is that there is a huge underestimation of the payment capacity. So most of the solutions, most of the programs towards slums, normally you don't charge anything. Most of them are sinking fund type of solutions, and you overestimate the subsidies that you need, because you're underestimating the payment capacity. It's not that people cannot pay. They're already paying a lot. And you'd normally overlook that thing when you do policy. I know that it's an argument that is maybe not very easy to deal with. It's I would say, I'm getting old, man. The words are not coming. The word will come. Misconceiving as a non-market phenomenon. That is, there is no self-construction. People, in most of them, particularly in big cities, people, this is the idea that people build their own houses. It's not true, particularly when we talk about, in most slum areas nowadays, most of the buildings are built in, at least in America, in Latin America, with bricks. They're not improvised woods and things like that. So that there is a need for understanding that this is, we're not talking about something that is completely out of the market. This is in slums, in most slums, in most informal areas, you have a very vivid market. And the transactions that are normally, they have to be reported to a association. Normally you have to even to pay some taxes, the transaction taxes, when you trade your property. The markets in most consolidated areas, we were talking in lunchtime, is dramatically increasing the rental market. This is the phenomenon that's being observed almost in every big city in Latin America. The rapid increase of the share of the buildings in particularly in consolidated areas that are on rentals. And why? Because you rent. Typically, the ratio of the rental to the price of the housing is about 3 to 4%. When in the formal market, it's about 0.5 to 0.8%. So it's a very profitable deal. And so it's no wonder why most of these areas are growing and growing fast upwards. Anyway, there's a lot to be discussed there. Slums and land markets. These are some photos of different places. And recently we have been working in Dandara and in Belo Horizonte. And this is a map of this is an occupation there. It's a big occupation on an area. There's a private area that is now being, but even before people already settled there, people are already selling that thing. The market is even in the occupation. This is a rental already in that area. This is in the first years of occupation already. So that's just to say that markets play a major role from the start of these occupations. This idyllic idea of people invading an area and occupy one doesn't exist anymore. People organize an occupation, and this is sometimes a business. You have to pay to be part of an organized occupation. Why slums? Well, location. Perhaps this is a component that was missing in George's component there. There is a big issue about location, and I already mentioned this thing about the Chile case of access to jobs. But just figure out the following thing: people don't have access to credit, and so you move and you're occupying some plot of land in the urban fringe. You know, if you consider the typical cost of transportation, $2 a day per individual, 2 people working in the peripheries, $4 a day for working. Capitalize this on 30 years at the reasonable interest rate. You know how much that is. This is something like $21,000. This is effective payment capacity that people actually have, but they can't use in the inner city because there is no option for them on that basis. This means that you're paying for a house that may be worth at the end something like $20,000 plus this $20-something thousand. So this is your effective capacity. So it's not that just the price of the housing. It's the price of the housing with the accessibility, the access do you have, and the transport cost is based. Oh, 1 minute. Is basically a surrogate for the credit system that you don't have. You only pay when you work. When you don't work, you don't pay. You have no access to credit one way or the other. There is a second thing that and I'm going very fast now, and let me show this. This is probably most of you already know. This is a famous diagram from Paul Barros showing about the difference between the formal occupations sequence and the informal one. But the interesting thing about that is not only that this is a reverse process of occupation, titling, servicing, planning, is that this is a strategy that you can actually internalize the land value increment that the process of occupation would generate one way or the other. In the other case, you pay this for a third party. In the informal, to some extent, you internalize it. Then the interesting issue that this thing brings about is in the informal areas where there is some public, some organization, some public investment, some redevelopment, should you collect, if you're talking about capturing value, should you capture value of that thing to the benefit of the community? And then we're beginning to talk about community land trust or something like that. In other words, other schemes where the community itself may be, the land may be owned by a association. You can trade in your house, the investment that you do in your house itself, but the land has to go through the association. This is one way of the community to protect themselves, and I think Pieterse is maybe talking something about that eventually, right? I don't know. Yeah, you will. I know. Then there is this. Well, I have a little time to go to that, but basically, it's development. Why is that developers are not interested in operating in the lower side of the market? Because there is always the way. This has to do with the renovation of the effective demand where people are willing to pay the most. This is a preferential option for the rich, that is, if you want. This is the typical incentive that the developers would rather produce. They would produce for the lower income, basically through the second-hand market, right? Well, these are things we can expand a little bit more. But I just wanted to finish with, we were talking here in this morning about regularization, failures. We're talking about, in 1948, in Rio de Janeiro, there was 6% of the population was in slum. 2016, 22%. Look at it in Peru, when they started to regularize in the 60s. There was about 6 or 7% also of occupation in informal. Nowadays, it's about 38%, in spite of all these regularization programs. So you have to ask the question, is the regularization the solution that's part of the problem, or the problem is part of the solution, right? And there are a number of ways of looking at these. Regularization has some of the downsides of regularization. It retrofit informality. This is something like informality begetting informality. So this is a study by Mena Barreto in São Paulo. It was a very interesting and simple study. Basically what she did is simply took it in informal areas, simply took the date the people arrived in that area, and when there was an intervention there. And there was always a spike in the years where an intervention was done. So basically the intervention in these areas attract new occupants. Just this is also measurable already. We have data on that in new subdivisions where the higher the perspective of getting something tomorrow, the more compelling is the argument that tomorrow the public, someone is going to invest there, the higher the price. So you're paying in anticipation for something that you promised that was going to happen. And this, of course, increases the prices. It's ineffective in the sense and we were talking about that during lunchtime. If you look at typically a regularization, an upgrading program that UN Habitat, what is the value, what is the rule of thumb? It's about $600 per capita for the upgrading programs, right? In the favela bairro in Rio, there was kind of a good case. It's about $3,000 to $5,000 per family. This is 2 to 3 times as much as what it would cost a new provision of new fully serviced housing land. So the question then is, why is that so hard? For instance, you look at it, you go to Rio de Janeiro, and then in the periphery, a plot of land offered in the market, fully serviced according with the legislation, etc., is about $145 per square meter. The cost of an unserviced plot of land in the urban periphery is about $70 to $80 a square meter. And the cost of servicing itself, 1 hectare, it's about $35 to $40 the square meter. So you figure out what are the consequences of that. So typically what happens is, and this is another dysfunction of the market that we've been talking, is that it's more profitable to subdivide land informally in the market than formally. And that is sort of a self-feeding process. So basically what you have is that there's a long discussion about the timing, about the licensing timing, but it's more profitable for someone to operate informally in the market nowadays, in the urban peripheries, than formally. Let's keep that thing. And the last part of this is that what happens, and talk about Michael said the idea of coming back to these places. What happened with most of these favelas that have been regularized or at some point have been improved? They still keep their stigma of being a favela, to the point that in many, in Rio de Janeiro, for instance, a city that I know a little bit better, you can rent an address if you're applying for a job. Because if you give the address where you live, you're not going to get it. But so you can rent that. Oh no, they will call you live in that area. It's fine. Just to give a. So we have to go from curative to preventive. I think my time is over, but I'm sorry I'm using a little bit more time. But not doing anything, and here's the dilemma: not doing anything is not a political option. You have to doing the curative policy has to be done. The question then is, how do you do it? How can you do it differently, right? And you have to talk about preventive. And what is to go preventively? Well, this is some of the things that have been mentioned here already. Go look at the bigger picture. How do you financing urban infrastructure? What is happening with land values when someone improves, when someone provides a benefit to the landowner? Who gets to get the benefit of it? Can some of this land value increment be used towards a redistributive thing of social housing or infrastructure, providing infrastructure where there is none? This kind of thing. We talk about a fiscal policy. We talk about transportation policy. We're talking about value capture policy. These are the changing of particularly the value capture policies. It's typically changing the rules of the game of how do you distribute the benefits and the costs of urbanization of the city. And this, I think, is an essential ingredient if you're thinking preventively on these issues. I don't have the time to spend on that. Perhaps in the discussion we can do something about that. I was asked to do something about climate change. I'm not doing it, but I'm going to just show you. You are fast readers. Yeah, just read one and read a second here, and that's it. Thank you much, and sorry for using too much of your time. Sorry for that.
All right, so now we're going to have Marty Chen, who is a lecturer in public policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, affiliated professor at the GSD, and international coordinator of the Global Research Policy Action Network, Women in Informal Employment, Globalizing and Organizing, WIEGO. Marty is an experienced development practitioner and scholar. Her areas of specialization are employment, gender, and poverty, with a focus on the working poor and informal economy. Marty is, like many folks here, is one of those folks who's both an academic and a practitioner, bringing those worlds together. Marty will, I think, bring us more into a discussion of the labor market and start to bring those conversations together. So, Marty, I'll have you come up and take your turn. Thank you.
Great. Good afternoon, and thank you so much to the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be here. And as Chris said, I'm going to try to bring in the labor market side of the informality of informal cities, because I think it's really important to understand how informal settlements are linked to the informal economy, what I call here the informal livelihoods. So I'm going to look, I was struck because I don't really study slums. I study the urban. I quickly went through some of the literature, and I was struck by the parallels in the literature on informal settlements and informal livelihoods. And then I'll talk about the linkages. And I was going to talk about just home-based workers in India. India is the country I know best. Although the WIEGO network works in 90 countries, India's where I grew up, so I really get it more than others. So I'll use home-based but other workers in urban India to illustrate the linkages, and then end with some thoughts on the way forward. But first, I'd like to share with you, these are the first ever global estimates of informal employment. They came out in May 2018. We've been working for 2 decades to get them, and we now have them. So, not in the tables, 61% of all workers globally are informally employed. That's 2 billion workers. So I was struck that that's twice as many people as are estimated to live in slums, right? So we do have to take this issue very seriously. The 2 tables show something about urban employment. So what you see is that informal employment globally is 44% of urban employment is informal. And I also thought I should bring in self-employment, because we now know that 42% of all urban workers are self-employed. So when you're self-employed, the links between the labor market and the housing land market are much more intense than if you're wage employed and you leave the slum to go to work in a hotel or restaurant or office. And we know that 45% of all workers globally are self-employed. So we really have to think differently about labor markets, folks. And these are the parallels that I saw with my quick scan of the literature. Both informal settlements and informal economy or informal livelihoods were thought for a long time to be something transitory. It would disappear. That was predicted. Arthur Lewis, there was the Lewis turning point, if you remember, in your economic history. But what we now realize is that they're pretty much here to stay. It's not a transitory, either phenomenon is not transitory. And we had Martim talk about the overlap with poverty. And clearly not all poor live in slums, and not all people in slums are poor, but most are, and many places, maybe not in Chile. And the same can be said about the informal economy. There's an overlap, but it's not a complete overlap. So not all informal workers are poor, and not all working poor are informally employed, but most are. And then when it comes to the problems that are faced by the informal slum dweller or the informal workers, insecure tenure. I mean, think about the street vendor in the city. It's about as insecure tenure as you can get. You have to keep your eye out for the police at pretty much any time of the day. And the tenuring process is costly and cumbersome and often quite futile to acquire the land and housing, but also to acquire the work permit or the workplace tenure. And lack of basic infrastructure services. People in the workplaces. I had a student who studied the biggest wholesale market in Dar es Salaam, where all the commodities came in from the rural area. It was completely informal. There was no water, there was no electricity. It was the center for distribution of everything in the city, but completely without basic infrastructure services. And then there's a lot of exposure to hazards. In the informal settlements, it has to do with the living conditions and whether you have sanitation and other things. And then there's shocks of all kinds. There's the climate change shocks. There's shocks from the state that comes and evicts and destroys. And there are market shocks as well. And on the work side, the working conditions have hazards, and they suffer a lot of shocks. And we've heard about the stigmatization. I can't say enough about the dominant narrative about the informal economy. The dominant narrative in mainstream economics is that either they're illegal or they're evaders, avoiders of regulation and taxation. They have low productivity. They're a drag on the economy, right? I mean, the stigmatization of the majority of workers in the world is significant. And they're seen as an urban governance challenge. And what is the result from their perspective is that the policy environment is actually really unpredictable or hostile. And it swings between sort of benign neglect to sudden evictions. So very parallel sets of processes for these two faces of the informal city. And then what are the linkages? Informal settlements are industrial hubs, maybe not the smallest ones, but the big ones for sure. There is so much economic activity happening in these informal settlements. And the homes in these informal settlements double as workplaces for the home-based workers, as places where you store things for the street vendors, for the waste pickers. Think of the bags of trash on top of the tin roofs of informal settlements for the waste pickers and others. And most slum dwellers are going to be informally employed. Not all. Certainly you have people who get up in the morning and go to offices and all of that in some of the bigger slums. And most informal workers live in slums, but not all. And the majority of urban informal workers are self-employed. So we have to think, and we think in the WIEGO network, not only about the land in the slum areas, but also public space. So there are two places where the informal self-employed tend to work in cities. One is public space, and in the more inner city, the better for them. And the other is private homes. Because if you can't rent a home to live, you certainly can't rent a home for a production unit. So that's where they're working for the most part. And I was intrigued by Martin's slide. We've got the location, location, location. Why do they live in those informal settlements or slums where it's very crowded, the home is not as productive a workplace, there's not much place for storage? It's location. They have to be near their contractors, their buyers, their customers, their suppliers. They have to, and as soon as you move them out, relocation, I cannot tell you the number of stories of informal workers who go bankrupt by the cost of transportation, right? Or they move to a new area and there's one bus in the morning and one bus in the evening. It assumes people go to an office at 9 o'clock and come home at 5 o'clock. If you're a construction worker and go into the recruitment corner and you don't get work that day, right? You want to come back home and do something else. It's not designed that way. People do not think about the work and productive needs of the informal. And I will say, I love the urban planners and designers because you talk about marks, you talk about who sets the rules of the game and who draws that legal line, but you don't talk about informal livelihoods, so please do take that on. It's the other side of the revolution, and they're linked, so we have to look at both. So home-based workers very quickly in India, and depending on the time, I'll bring in a couple of others. Figures. Home-based workers in India, as a percentage of non-ag, you do have some ag workers in urban areas, but if you look, 14% of all urban workers in modern India are home-based. And you look at women, it's 32%, right? So 1/3 of women workers in India are home-based. And there are a lot of reasons for that, some cultural, some not. If you look at the informal enterprises, which are called unorganized enterprises in India, 43% of informal enterprises are home-based, and 36% of all enterprises are home-based. I've been told that 80% of automobile parts in India are made in homes, right? Now think of the size of the homes, think of those homes, right? So where are they found in the different branches of the economic activities? So the vast majority are in manufacturing, but it's of many, many, many kinds. They do make automobile parts, they make airline cushions, they process food, they assemble electronics, they package pharmaceuticals, you name it, they're doing it. They're in so many branches of manufacturing. Some of them run storefronts right from their home, so they're in trade. A lot in personal services of various kinds. There's catering and little restaurants run at home, and there are those who tutor and educate people from their home. This doesn't add up to 100, there are more, but these are all the ones where it was 3% or more of the home-based workers. So they're in every branch of activity, as you can see it. So what are the constraints if your home is your workplace and you're living and working in an informal settlement? What hampers your productivity and what hampers your earnings? The size of the house, because the smaller it is, and they're all the studies I do, it's 1, maybe 2 room houses. The doubles, the children have to nap, you have to stop sewing, you have to entertain the guests that come to visit your husband. Your productivity is interrupted because the house is small. And poor quality, if it floods or if the roof leaks, the raw materials are damaged, you can't dry the processed food that you've been doing. And the lack of the basic infrastructure services. It decreases your time available for production, and it decreases your productivity in any case, and it increases your expenditure. During the economic crisis in Lahore, Pakistan, where we work, 2 women committed suicide because the cost of electricity had gone up and the supply had become more irregular, and they couldn't meet the work orders for supply chains. And others of them talked about working at night, holding a cell phone in their mouth so they could finish the stitching or whatever they were doing by the light of the cell phone. Oh my God, I've only got 1 minute, okay. And then of course, insecure housing tenure discourages them from improving their homes, which double as workplace. Just a point about zoning, somebody referenced it. If it's zoned for single use, the fact that they're doing commercial activities makes them liable to sweeps by the police. So mixed-use zoning for residents of residential areas is something that's important to consider. But given these, despite all of these constraints, they would rather be in that slum location near their work orders, near their buyers, near their customers. If you're rolling cigarettes for a contractor, if you're rolling incense sticks for a contractor, and you're relocated to the periphery of the city, you're not going to get the work orders anymore. You're too far away from the contractor. It really affects all of their work. So I can't go into the other groups. So let me just see the nexus of land, housing, and labor market through their eyes, just summarize the home-based workers. They face all of these constraints, which reduce their productivity and earnings, but they prefer to live in those informal settlements. I can't tell you that enough, because they need to be near the contractors, buyers, customers, and suppliers. Just an example of a domestic worker. If a domestic worker in India is shifted from her inner city informal settlement to a housing, the trouble is she tended to work for not one household during the day. She would wash utensils in one house and do laundry in another, and she's away from that whole, it makes, the relocation is really dislocation. And what they want is the secure housing tenure and the basic infrastructure services and the transport services in these informal settlements near the centers of cities. So way forward, one is recognition that these informal settlements and private homes and public spaces are the main places of work for the 61% of the workforce that's informal. That informal settlements are industrial hubs. We have to look at the productivity losses with relocations, and that these markets are very interlinked. The way forward, as far as we're concerned, and I know we share this with Sheila Patel and the Slum Shack Dwellers International, is the way forward has to involve the organizations of the urban poor, whether it's slum dwellers, because they know what they need more than any of us could ever. So they need their collective representative voice in urban planning processes. And we're trying to make this even statutory. So it's not a one-time consultation, it's an ongoing. And there needs to be joint action, and so SDI and WIEGO have joined hands on many occasions so that the organizations of slum dwellers and of urban informal workers join hands. And we need the housing rights activists to join hands with the labor activists and the other activists, because this is an integrated problem and challenge. And we need urban scholars, planners, and designers. And we do need the like-minded economists who focus on employment. I know there aren't too many, but we all need to join hands. And there have been some really good examples. And the Habitat 3 process and the informal livelihoods are integrated into the new urban agenda. And it took a lot of doing, but it's there. Thank you.
Thank you, Marty. And I should have mentioned at the outset that Marty, I believe, is trained as an anthropologist, so we're starting to diversify our panel. And thank you, Marty, for being open to holding hands with economists.
Only some.
Only like-minded ones. Okay, our last speaker is Professor Edgar Pieterse, who is the founder and director of the African Center for Cities. He also holds the South African Research Chair in Urban Policy at the University of Cape Town. He's a scholar, writer, curator, creative agent. He's another person who I think embodies both, straddles the worlds of academia and also practice, who has a broad list of things that he is involved with. And I think he'll be moving the conversation from kind of diagnosing the situation to talking about what we can do, so moving more towards the innovation. So please welcome me in joining and welcoming Edgar Pieterse.
Okay, thank you, Chris, and thank you for the organizers for putting this event together. It's wonderful to be here. So in the spirit of the theme, I need a hookup. I need some aspirin. Can anyone hook me up with some aspirin or headache tablets? Anything. The stronger, the better.
Yeah, I've got one.
And a whiskey wouldn't be bad either. So what can I say? I mean, so many economists in a row. How much can a man take?
Here's an Advil from a non-economist. From a Ganesh pillbox. I mean, really, very
The anthropologist will hook me up every time. Okay, good. I'm good. Thank you. Okay, so let's go. Very limited time, so this is sort of a really condensed attempt to throw a couple of words at you, and hopefully it makes some kind of sense. And it's the beginning of new work, so it is completely incoherent. But it does take off from this idea that Malik Simone and I have tried to develop in the last book called New Urban Worlds, where we talk about makeshift urbanism as a way of getting away from the binaries that we've been deconstructing and debating the last day and a half. And the two problematics that I want to put in relation to each other is this question that Marty just spoke about vulnerable employment as a constitutive fact of where capitalism is going, and the nature of the urban economies that we're concerned with. And particularly in the geographical territory that I'm concerned with, Sub-Saharan Africa, a really limited access to basic services. And how can we think these two things in relational terms as a way of getting at what some of the responses could be? So to go to the aerial view, I've deleted the drone shots, but this does exactly the same thing. And this is from the very recently published African Union OECD report looking at growth and inequality. And so the numbers speak for themselves, but the employment number adjacent to the Gini number is really significant, because if you look at GDP per capita on average for Sub-Saharan Africa, compared to other world regions, to have the Gini at already 41 points is absolutely frightening. You can see a decade and a half of really robust 4.6% average growth. We've still, in absolute terms, increased the number of people below the 1.9 poverty line. And then the key data point there is the 66% of the labor market that is in vulnerable employment. Now, if you project forward from the same report, Africa, of course, has got the most robust demographic profile at the moment. And so the labor market expansion that will unfold over the next 35 years is by far the most dramatic in sub-Saharan Africa. And as you can see, interestingly enough, in China, there's an anticipated decline, and that's because of the aging population and the fertility profile that we know is unfolding there. Now, what is occupying people on the continent is this weird temporal moment that this demographic and urban transition is taking place in the sort of long-term unfolding history of capitalism and modernity. And this is that there seems to be an unprecedented pattern emerging in sub-Saharan Africa where labor market incorporation is skipping the formalization through manufacturing towards services, and it's going straight in this informal arc towards the service economy. And as a result of this, we have the formal labor force is not really expanding, despite the incredible demographic expansion that is happening, and we see what Marty was just explaining as pretty much what will be the foreseeable future. Now, the sort of retrospective data is interesting as well, because we'll see that from the beginning of the post-colonial era in the 1960s, we've actually had a net decline in manufacturing as a share of GDP, right? So this is not something new, and again, more recent data shows that despite the really significant aggregate GDP growth rate since 2000, which was sort of the moment that marks the narrative of Africa rising, we've seen hardly any decline in the share of the labor force that's in vulnerable employment. So that's sort of then unsurprisingly, there's a relationship with the proportion of the population in sub-Saharan Africa and informal settlements. And again, of course, across the continent, there's enormous variabilities. If you look at one of the parts of the continent that is going to grow the fastest, DRC and Ethiopia, the vast majority of the urban population live in slums. Now, to come back, I guess, to the theme of Martin's talk, if we look at the fiscal capacity to deal with this, it is really frightening. So this is sort of some rough calculations to just look at municipal fiscal capacity on a per capita person per year, and you will see that because of the unique local government dispensation in South Africa, the per capita spend is around $700, and the next city after sort of a typical South African city is Addis at $91 per capita. And if you contrast that with what a sort of an OECD city like London or Seoul spends per person, you begin to get a sense of the size and the shape of the problem, right? So, so this is not simply a question of regularization of it just is, you know, in the language of the World Bank, as Michael will tell us, is these places ain't bankable, right, in the current parameters of how the global system operates. So some of the key characteristics of this makeshift urbanism that I want to foreground, and we've heard, you know, sort of a fantastic elaboration of a more precise definition, and so I'm going to kind of pull us in a more murky, sort of less precise definition, because I think that resonates more closely with the complexity of the multiplicity of systems that interact, is that service delivery, of course, is taking place. But it is these hybrid systems. And I'm really intrigued by the work of Sylvia Jaglin that has kind of tried to theorize what these hybridities mean between the formal and the informal, the pirating of the formal systems, and how urban configurations are sort of mutually constructed in that way. But again, as Martim has indicated, that, you know, this way of accessing urban opportunities are incredibly expensive. And so it's a drain on productivity, and it is almost always accompanied with predatory forms of control and regulation. So this ain't no pretty picture, right? This is tough, violent, abusive urban politics, which doesn't mean there's no agency, but it isn't an easy reality to contend with and to think through in terms of institutional responses. What we do see, though, because of the MDGs, is that there's been a significant increase in the provision of social development services, education and health, but the quality is incredibly low and variable. And so the social mobility that you'd expect from that level of investment as a proportion of GDP is not filtering through. And of course, I think Marty also mentioned this point, that within all of these various reforms that are taking place, what is absolutely striking is the utter neglect of the public realm, right? It's kind of just this void. There's no investment going in, and it is the sort of realm of that kind of almost serves as a kind of a vortex of reproduction of all kinds of exclusions. So that's sort of, so the numbers are, they're rough, right? I mean, it's, you know, both rough as in they're not really accurate, but that's a tough picture to stare in the face of. And so I think sort of theoretically, of course, we can kind of think our way along the grain of the data and the numbers and so forth, or we can kind of step outside of them, and that's kind of what I want to play with a little bit, is, you know, have a spliff. So the sort of entry point is to think of these dramatic service delivery deficits as a mechanism to think of bolstering the local economy through sort of a kind of skills acquisition in collective practices that expands the sort of what in some parts of the literature is called the social economy. And to ask the question whether we can rethink the sort of modern project of a network service provision through infrastructure in ways that activates also environmental sustainable loops and of resource flows, right? So let's just start with a different question. And to think of the one policy mechanism that does seem to have some kind of durability over the decades, this idea of public works. And at a moment where there's been a recognition that infrastructure spend is a useful counter-cyclical fiscal instrument to kind of grab onto that mainstream logic and say an important part of that spend should be thought through the deployment of public works. And the idea then is to see how these public works can activate new forms, new institutional modalities of service delivery, and of course, implicitly, the need to instigate new institutions as well. However, what does seem to me to be critical in this is that there's got to be an explicit spatial understanding driven through what I would imagine to be an investment in design and budget literacy amongst community members to define and decide on what should be done, where it should be done, and how it should be done, and how that, very importantly, articulates with the city region. So this is not a politics or an economic frame of hyperlocalism. It is about a grounded politics that can speak back to the larger city regional questions of distribution. I'm not going to go through the detail of the slide, you'd be happy to know, but just to kind of give you a sense that there is an attempt to map kind of what is the status quo, what are ways of beginning to rethink that from the literatures from environmental sustainability, from the sort of resource efficiency literatures, et cetera, but then also to think from an ecological infrastructure systems perspective, and then to think through institutional implications. So there's sort of a much larger canvas that I'm working on with various colleagues at the African Center for Cities and so on. But within that frame, what I'm interested in specifically, I guess, is placemaking. And so one story from Cape Town, two crazy guys happened to find themselves in the Department of Environmental Affairs, and they are working on aliens and using public workers to clear alien vegetation, because of course it's a massive drain on water resources in a drought-stricken area. And so over the last 6-7 years, they've, okay, so you're more generous than I am, that's very cool. So, but now I can't switch this off, and there goes all my time. Cancel, how do I put this off? Someone call Steve Jobs from the grave, please. Can someone help me? Cancel. Start, pause, okay, thank you. I am, you know, in Cambridge, thank you. Okay, it's helpful to be in the tech capital of the world. Anyway, so what they've done is they've done this amazing product where they've created a construction material for public housing using wood chips from alien vegetation, and they only use 10% of the cement content that you'd normally use in construction. And they've designed with this a process that these public workers can be enrolled in to construct public housing in a 100% non-mechanical way in gangs of 12 to 14, and they can complete a 2-story public house within 12 days. Okay, so the very long story, and I can give you all the detail and so on. The point is that this could absolutely revolutionize one of the largest public housing programs in the world, which South Africa does have, and it has been disastrous up to now. And so by entering from the angle of resource efficiency, public works, and so forth, one can then work back to some of the more conventional infrastructure investments. So at the moment, we're kind of mapping out, and again, don't worry about the detail, to think at the different instances within community life, whether it is educational spaces, whether it's nutrition, whether it's cultural practices, sport, recreation, mobility, etc., the different ways in which one can configure social enterprises on the back of public works systems to build much more vibrant local economies that maps onto collective practices that we kind of know works and don't work. And again, we can have this conversation with Sheila and with other SDI members and so on, but kind of is much more open-ended, because what it's about is about building place, identity in relation to the collective infrastructures that's required to deal with some of the more violent and vicious expressions of structural poverty, right? So the lack of ECD, early childhood development, the absence of food-producing spaces, et cetera, and this is just sort of an example of work we're doing with 2 architectural studios at the University of Cape Town, where over the last 3 years we've worked in this neighborhood called Delft, which is just behind the airport for those who've been in Cape Town, which is a classic post-apartheid public housing settlement with massive informality that have grown in the backyard, similar to what we've heard in Los Angeles. And this is just to intimate what the possibilities could be. And I have to stop, and I can't talk to this, which is about the sort of citizenship questions and how does one anchor that down into this a different kind of political literacy about placemaking. Thank you.
All right. All great presentations. It's a lot of information. And we are moving well into our time. I had a few questions I was going to pose, but I think having not done my job as moderator to keep the conversation, I've given up my ability to ask questions. A couple of observations, I guess. One is that I think I started out with the premise of saying, how can we think about the way these different markets are integrated? I think particularly Marty and Edgar's presentations are really focused on that. I'll put on the table, I'm not going to do it, but to challenge Martim and George, I think, George, your frame seemed to suggest the ability to pay was fundamentally behind the problem, and therefore might lend itself, perhaps in a simplistic interpretation, that expanding the ability to pay would help to perhaps address the problem. But I think, and Martim, you seem to suggest that there's plenty of ability to pay, so that wasn't, the people were already paying, so there might have been more of a question of saying, how do we make that more effective? I'll put that on the table and leave it aside for now because I want to open it up to the audience. And I think, George, you started us off with a provocative question of saying, okay, I'm going to be brave enough to put on the table what a definition of a slum is. And I think there'd be an interesting, perhaps a very long conversation among the panelists about your definition of saying that it's substandard housing. I think there's a lot more to it than that. But I'll put those both on the table to see if they come up. But why don't we, following the model we've been following, take, say, 3 questions to start, put them on the table, and then we'll turn back to the panelists. Yeah, we'll start right here.
Mine is a combined kind of question, and it will be what had to do. First, this morning I was saying that I believe that the problem is global in the sense that to look at the slums is to concentrate too much in points when the problem is more expanded in the globe. So my question would be, what has to do the low price of Gap trousers here with low wages in the capacity to pay for affordable housing with the question of informal employment in India. Is there any relation, or is my imagination?
All right. Yes, here in the middle, up here.
Question is mostly for Martha. I really enjoyed your talk. And I was wondering, the picture you paint, I think, also applies to Boston. And would you agree with me that the level of informal employment and the compensation to informal workers is almost certainly way underestimated, because anybody in the informal economy would have to have a lot more trust than I do in the establishment to tell the truth in any survey.
And just to be fair, do we have anybody on this side of the room? Mac?
So George, I need to complicate your analysis a little bit, because if it were merely the production of standard housing and the ability to afford it, then there's been lots of programs in the world where they've produced lots of standard housing that lays vacant. Mexico has 5 million units of housing that were subsidized by the national government. They were just built in the wrong places that nobody wants to live in. South Africa has 300,000 units of housing they built where they were going to depopulate the slums and just move people 60, 70 kilometers outside of Cape Town, but nobody wanted to live there, right? In Brazil, 1 million units in Minha Casa, Minha Vida. 4 million? Oh, now 4 million. It used to be 1 million. Now they're doing more. So I think we need maybe to add the location, and something else to kind of understand it's more than just the ability to command standard housing. There's something else about, the spatial distribution, right?
All right. If that's not enough for you, we'll just, Edgar, we'll go down from left to right here. Take your choice of
Your
this.
left. What?
What
I'm right of the panel.
You're
I'm
right.
to the right of
To
the
my left.
to your left. None of the questions were directed at me, so I was just trying to dodge.
You want, we can,
No, it's all good, all good.
take your pick.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess to build on Mac's question, so the obvious sort of the immediate answer would be location and opportunity, to kind of do all kinds of things in a way that allows you to build a set of economic activities that has the potential for growth. But I do think, coming back to your important provocation this morning, that it is a lot more than that. And I think that the fact that we don't have a strong enough cultural understanding of why people want to be where they are, what gives them meaning, and how that shifts over time, and the generational nature of those things. So, for example, in both Latin America and Africa, the Pentecostal church has been incredibly important, as it has in North America, I guess, in shaping new political subjectivities, but also in being the primary intersection point for accessing intelligence and knowledge and opportunity in the city, right? And it's not on our radar. It's not in our analytical frame. We don't understand the value and the significance of those attachments and institutional opportunities, but not just as a utilitarian thing, but very importantly as a source of affective resonance in terms of who I am in this incredibly complicated place. And I think that our analysis and therefore our prescriptions are profoundly impoverished, because we're not able to think beyond the immediate utilitarian aspects of location, of income, and security of tenure, whatever the case might be. So just kind of to build on your reflection, I guess.
The first question on the links between the low price of Gap trousers and informal workers in India. We do know, we don't have actual figures, but we do know that much of the outsourced production in garments and textiles is produced in the informal economy at two levels. One is in the factories, where you'll have, I know this from Bangladesh, you'll have a core factory workers, and then you'll have some that are periphery. When the inspector comes, the manager presses a bell, it plays the national anthem in the factory, and all those who are non-standard leave by the back door if it's not blocked. So there's a very immediate strong link, and we know that anywhere from 40 to 60% of the labor force in export manufacturing and garments and textiles are home-based. Yeah, so there is a link. On the informal economy in Boston, I have my students go out every year and do a field exercise to meet street vendors, waste pickers, kitchen truckers, janitors, domestic workers, Uber drivers, and to decide how formal and informal they are in terms of regulation, protection, any social protection, and any kind of promotion. And it's fascinating. You learn all about the city. On the measurement, the head of our statistics program has written a blog, her name is Joanne Vanek, on 6 myths about measuring the informal, right? If India has 93% of households are reporting that 93% of the workers are informal, there's not that much evasion of saying what they do, because in their own eyes, what they're doing is not illegal, right? So the illegal criminal underground slice of the whole informal workforce is very small, probably, right? And those may be ones who would disguise what they do or underreport. But we have no problem in, and what we know in the US and in Europe is that some countries, it's more the countries, whether they're willing to pick it up. So the instruments, the survey instruments in the US and some countries are not adjusting to the new forms of informality in the country. So we have people working on the actual survey questions, because the nature of work is not, how do we report employment in this country? It's employment and unemployment, right? And employment is formal wage employment. It's not capturing a lot, right? But I don't think it's because people are not reporting. I think we don't know how to ask, because we don't find, yeah? So we're working, just one other thing. We're working on a new meta-category of dependent contractor, which would be your Uber driver, right, in today's world, but the industrial outworker. The person from the US Bureau of Labor Statistics says, well, we can't have a category. That's not a category in law. And it's like, you know, and you're saying the point is the statistics have to reflect reality, and then the law will begin to reflect reality, right? So I don't think it's a problem of people not reporting, except the few that are real evaders, right? But, or truly illegal.
So, cost of jeans and informal sector. I think that there are lots of important connections between the global north and the global south that relate to this question of slum formation and the causes thereof. And it goes in both directions. So on the one hand, Marty just framed the answer to her question as if it's a problem that American companies are contracting their work for jeans in the informal sector of the global south. And I would say it'd be a bigger problem for the global south if they all stayed home and had highly unionized workers in the United States producing those jeans. There'd be less demand for workers and more poverty in the southern hemisphere. So I think that the flow of higher paying industrial jobs from the global north historically to the global south has been part of the economic development of the global south to its benefit, to the detriment of the income distribution in the United States. And it's one of the worrisome trends for slum formation in the United States, I think, to have these kinds of international flows going the way they've been going in terms of where production is taking place of goods. Now, the financial flows, however, are working in the opposite way. The financial flows are distorting markets not only in the first world, but I think in the third world as well. And so I think that the mortgage markets are perhaps screwed up in a lot of the second world cities and third world cities because they're seeking higher returns that can be available in financial instruments that are being produced in the northern tier cities. And that's starving a lot of the potential mortgage finance from doing its job, building housing in the third world. Now, I'm going to push back, Mac, as you would expect me to, on this notion of, well, it's just about housing quality. You're only giving half of my definition. It's the relationship between the slums are a problem of housing quality, but the reason for slums is the imbalance between the cost of occupying decent quality housing and ability to afford that. And if you talk about building good quality housing in the middle of nowhere, I would argue that the cost of occupying it are huge. As you mentioned, the transportation costs involved in occupying inaccessible housing are huge. And so you can either argue that's not high quality housing because it's in the middle of nowhere, or you can say in physical terms it's high quality, but its cost of occupying it is huge. Either way, I'm going to stick with my diagnosis. And I think that the root problem that is common to all of these places we've been talking about is the poor quality of the housing. Now, I'm not saying that's the entire story because I tried to develop these flavors, but I think that's a common element. There's absolutely differences in location and formality and informality and legality and illegality and whether it's stigmatized or not. And all of those variations create difficulty in defining what we're talking about. But I'm still arguing that the one commonality to all these things and places we've called by different names is that the housing quality is substandard. That's the unifying link, I would still argue.
All right, Marty has a response.
I have a thing with economists. There's another counterfactual, that the jobs could be better, right?
And better located.
No, not locate. I mean, the outsourced jobs that you're saying is good for development in the South, I'm saying those jobs could be better, right? It's not just the absence of jobs. And we're living in an era where the relative power of labor and capital it's gone out of the,
Absolutely.
And those labor have no power.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's just my counterfactual. I never know how to argue it with economists, but those jobs could be better. They're pretty bad jobs, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Can I tell you the worst job? And this relates to GAP. If you're an industrial outworker working in your own home, which a lot of garment workers are, you are paid less than the factory worker doing similar work. And you provide the workplace, you provide the equipment, you pay for the electricity, and you go back and forth to the contractor to get the raw materials, the work orders, and to return the finished goods.
Humanity is expensive.
It is exploitation, right? And that's the way the global system is working, right? So we're trying to say that the piece rate for a home-based subcontracted worker has to have a premium for all of the non-wage costs of production that she covers, right? And they suffered delayed payments. The system exploits. Yeah. So what can I say? That's not a very economist statement.
I don't know. It is. It's
I disagree, it really is.
rent seeking.
Yeah, okay.
Martim.
You wear that hat.
Yeah, and I guess the issue of ability to pay, affordability is always a ratio, right? It's the income, wage, whatever, and the price of what you're buying, right? And we're talking about, particularly in Latin America, and I don't know much about Africa, but the land prices are immense, are obscene, I would say. If you compare the land prices of service land in the urban peripheries of big Latin American cities with the U.S., you will find sometimes even in absolute terms higher there than here, where the income is 5 times or 10 times as much. So that there is something terribly wrong with the land markets that produces land prices that are so high. And that is, the answer for why is that has to do with how you provide urban infrastructure and services, and how you distribute and where you locate them. You have areas in the cities there are second to none or any bright areas of London or Paris or New York, and other areas that's just like Bangladesh. So there is no service, no nothing. So this is really what generates this very skilled land prices gradients, typically in Latin American cities that replicates. But my problem is taking the thing one step further. It's how many of the kind of policies that we're doing to deal with the consequence, the curative thing of the existing informal thing, how many of them are actually feeding the problem itself. It's not actually producing or facilitating or reducing, at the end of the day, the prices of service land. It's actually increasing them for the way it's being done. So that the many of these regularization programs are actually being more of a part of the problem than the solution. That is, I think, it's a big issue. We have to start thinking a little bit beyond the curative policies if we want to address seriously how can you intervene in this market without provoking higher land prices. And certain types of subsidies are more of a problem than a solution. Certain types of subsidy, the way you do them. So there are a number of these issues that one has to start. For instance, I'll give you a simple example. A typical upgrading program of a slum or a favela. If you look at the very conservative numbers, where the typical housing may be $10,000 to $15,000, and the cost of an intervention take something like as $3,000, and you look at, okay, once you're providing the basic service that you can integrate allegedly in the urban fabric, in the urban, you would say, okay, now you got to pay your property taxes. With the property tax, if you take the property taxes on the new value, updated with the infrastructure, you can, and you capitalize that, or take the present value of that stream of the, it will pay something like 60% of the cost of the intervention. So what kind of signal are you giving when you do this kind of policy, when you're introducing, it is a provision of services, but there is something that you're going to give some signals in order to be able to expand that thing at the. I was going to raise a issue.
Martim.
A quick one.
Okay.
Quick one. If you look at the regularization programs, and I've been looking at the evaluations of the evaluating the evaluations of the regularization programs, you'll be appalled with what most of these evaluations write, the reports on these evaluation programs do. Most of them are basically addressing or reaching out 20% of what was intended originally at a higher cost, and with a consequence that normally is perverse. So just figure out. So are we going to continue to do this kind of a regularization program, trying to draw this is Penelope task or whatever, or trying to dry ice, doing these this kind of program the way we're doing? How long are we going to continue to do this thing? It's not improving at all the problem that we're trying to deal with that. Sorry, I know that's a provocative argument, but I stick to that.
I hate to end on such a negative note, and we are out of time. What I'd like to do, though, I know it's kind of frustrating to have your hand up, not get your chance to say something. So very quickly, what I'd like to do is, folks who still have something to say, we may not have a chance to respond, but maybe you can put them forth and we can talk about them over the break. So can we do it very quickly? Pass the mic. So we got Michael and Alejandro, Brody, Teresa.
Okay, thanks. I'm Teresa Williamson. I run Catalytic Communities. I'm an urban planner. We've been working for 18 years with favela communities in Rio. I thought that the two slides Martim showed at the very end that we didn't get to look at because it was over time. One was Prazeres, which is a favela where, in fact, today my co-director is there as part of an environmental zero waste summit that's being held in the community. That's a direct result of that landslide picture that we saw in 2010. The other one was of Morro do Bumba, which is a favela in Niterói that used to be on top of an infill site, a waste site, and it came down. They came down in the same set of storms. And I think these two cases are really instrumental to understand why a lot of these conversations here in some ways may or may not produce results because these communities are so inherently diverse. Just those two communities that here on slides are shown as if they're comparable are complete polar opposites. The first one, Prazeres, their landslide was because of waste that filled up on the hillside. and lack of engineering support from the government, which would have been very inexpensive relative to any sort of relocation. 100+ people died. What the community did was they responded by doing a whole mapping analysis of the community, discovering that that waste was the major problem, that the community needed to galvanize around this, and they've now been organizing for 8 years solidly. They've developed one of the best waste collection co-ops in Rio. Everybody in the favela recycles. And the other one, Morro do Bumba, was literally on top of a waste site that should never have been settled in the first place, was not safe, and those residents are still waiting public housing 8 years later. Public housing was built for them. 18 million reais were spent on it before huge cracks appeared. They had to demolish it, and residents are still waiting 8 years later for their housing. And so I think we end up looking at these cases and thinking, oh, the residents and all of these, but every single community is so unique. And now we're talking about 2 in Rio of 1,000, and then now here at the then we're talking Latin America, right? Brazil, Latin America, then Africa, Asia. We're talking about communities that are brand new, and you can argue are slums. Then we're talking about communities that are consolidated like those in Rio that should really not be called slums anymore. It's totally counterproductive. They are not always substandard housing. The community of Vila Autódromo, which was evicted for the Olympics, was large homes with good lots, large, comfortable. People had invested over generations. They had mostly been well employed. The kids were mostly in college. And they were a favela. They were not a slum. They came up with a plan that they developed themselves with the universities in Rio to resettle on site, not resettle, to improve the housing and maintain it with the Olympic Park. Would have cost 13 million reais. The city ended up spending over 200 million reais to remove them. Yes, they prefer their community to any of the alternatives. There were people that were even offered market rate who didn't want it. In an area that's very expensive. So these assumptions we bring in about what these communities are, they really don't hold. And it's community by community. Residents have to be asked what their priorities are. And if we don't create systems that really go from that point as the starting point, we're not going to get anywhere. I'd love to see a conference like this where Herbert and Lincoln invite all community leaders and organizers from all these different countries. As a follow-up to this conference, because this local reality is what needs to be here, because we're not going to find any solutions otherwise. And what are the solutions, right? As Brody points out, informality was how everything developed until we decided to label things differently. And so we've created all of this. So how much of this is really about changing our lens? So anyway, I just wanted to share that because it's been bubbling up inside me. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm not sure, we're way over time. I don't know whether we can keep going or we should take the break. Should we, Brody, can you be fast? Okay, fast.
So the discussion between economists and other social scientists is often that economists elegantly simplify things, and then we tell you how the elegant simplification distorts everything. So I'm going to follow that stereotype. I think that there was something very interesting in George's presentation in the way that he presented a sequence of events. So you talked about capitalist markets being created to produce slums. There are lots of things one could pick apart there, but I think the conclusion is that the ability to pay is beneath the cost, and so therefore you end up with slums, which makes sense. Except that I think that the next step that you say is that public policy then needs to deal with the problem of policy, the problem with poverty. But I think there's a problem of order there, because the assumption that's inherent in that sequence is that public policy had nothing to do with either the ability to pay or the cost of the product. And the problem in most countries is that public power is way too involved in tipping the scale in such a way that some people's values go up more quickly than others, some people's ability to profit from capitalism goes up more quickly than others. And when the line of formality and informality is drawn, that is a way of actually accruing value in the hands of people who already have the resources to buy into the formal market. And so I would just, as a non-economist, I would try to speak your language and say that if we don't, in that initial formulation, take into account the role of public power in creating the value of things and the ability to pay for them, then we end up with fundamentally distorted policies.
All right. Michael, do you want to quick, yeah. Whitney, right over here.
I just had a quick question for Edgar. In the formulation of the sort of new way of thinking about social economy, what do you do with labor supply? That was the question.
Can you answer that quickly, or? No. So, all right. Alejandro, did you, no? All right. So, thank you all. Please join me in thanking the panel. There's a lot to talk about.